Hello and welcome to Reproduction 1. This is the third in a series of 4 podcasts. This podcast will detail the female reproductive system. So if we look at the cartoon in the lower right hand part of the slide, you see the full body of a female, and then you can see the female reproductive system housed in her pelvic cavity, and then you take that system and enlarge it, and you can see what you have before you. So let's start at the bottom of the cartoon with the vagina. So you can see there's folds inside the vagina. Those are called vaginal rugae, and if you recall, we saw rugae in the bladder and in the stomach, and rugae just helps the organ that they're in expand. So if you travel up the vagina, the first thing you'll enter is the cervix. So the cervix is a muscular organ. It's made of smooth muscle. There's a external os, which is the entrance into the cervix. And then there's these spaces that the vagina creates as it goes around the cervix. Those are called fornix, the lateral fornix. As you go up through the cervical canal, then the next structure you enter is the uterus. And some books describe it as a pear-shaped organ. But you've got the fundus. So if you look at the top, you can see where it says fundus of the uterus. Hopefully you remember when we did digestive system, you saw a fundus of the stomach. So that's just kind of like a little hill sort of structure, anatomical structure, the fundus of the uterus. And then the mass, or the most part of the uterus, is called the body of the uterus. I don't know why I keep wanting to say universe. It's interesting. So, body of the uterus. And then if you look on the right-hand side of the cartoon, it says there is a wall. The uterus has a wall. And the innermost layer of the wall of the uterus is called the endometrium. And that's the part of the uterus that sheds once a month in menstruation. And then more superficial to the endometrium of the wall of the uterus is the myometrium, and that's muscle metrium. So that's smooth. Those are smooth muscle cells. And then on the outermost or superficial layer of the uterus is the perimetrium. So that's it's sort of a capsule and serous membrane. And then it says there's an internal os, a cervical canal, and an external os. So an os is just an opening. So the internal opening to the uterus is the internal os, and the external opening to the uterus via the cervix is called the external os. Okay, so then if we go up through the uterus, if we keep traveling, if we're traveling towards the ovaries, we can see that we enter the uterine tube. So lateral from the uterus, we enter the uterine tube. It used to be called the fallopian tube. And there's parts. The uterine tube is long, so there's different parts. The first part, or the most proximal part to the uterus of the uterine tube, is called the isthmus. And then as you travel outward towards the ovary, the uterine tube then becomes, where it gets wider, it's called an ampulla. And then where the uterine tube spreads out into finger-like projections, that's called the infundibulum. And then the fimbriae are the finger-like projections at the most distal end of the uterine tube. And then you can see that the fimbriae sort of have a lacy appearance around the ovary. So now to hold the uterine tube and the ovary in place, you need several ligaments. So if you look at the left side of the cartoon, it has in bold, says the broad ligament. So the broad ligament holds many different structures in place. And there's 3 parts of the broad ligament. There's the mesosalpinx, the mesovarium, and the mesometrium. And you can kind of see from the cartoon that the mesosalpinx is connected to the fallopian tube. The mesovarium covers the ovary, and then the mesometrium is kind of between the uterus and the ovary and the fallopian tube. And then, of course, there's just below the broad ligament is the ovarian ligament that holds the ovary. You can see in the cartoon the ovarian ligament holds the ovary to the uterus. And then if you look up at the left side of the cartoon, it says there's a suspensory ligament of the ovary. So that, again, is holding to the ovary to the pelvic cavity. And then there are other ligaments. There's if I'm looking at the lower left-hand part of the cartoon, there's a uterosacral ligament and a cardinal or a lateral cervical ligament. And then if I look over at the at the right-hand side of the cartoon, there's a round ligament of the uterus. And we'll go over those ligaments in more detail in a minute. So the ovaries then have a endocrine function. That is, they produce hormones. The hormones they produce are estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone are classic hormones. They're looking for receptors to bind to, and they find those receptors on cells of the uterus, and they also find those receptors on cells in the brain that we'll talk about later. The ovaries have an exocrine function. That means they produce something, they secrete something, and what they secrete is an oocyte, aka an egg. And the egg usually doesn't come just as an egg. It's got surrounding follicular cells. So we'll look at the fallopian tubes in a little bit more detail. Once the egg is ovulated during ovulation, then the egg can stay in the uterine tube for 3 to 4 days, and you would call it the fallopian tube then. Well, in this cartoon, they've actually got the fallopian tube called the oviduct. So you can call it the uterine tube, the oviduct, or the fallopian tube. But if fertilization occurs in the first 24 hours, once the egg has arrived in the fallopian tube, if it gets fertilized, if that egg gets fertilized within the first 24 hours, then you call that the fertilization site. And then we talked earlier in this podcast about the fimbriae of the fallopian tubes at the end of the infundibulum of the fallopian tubes. And what happens when the egg is ovulated, those fimbriae will catch the egg and kind of through a gentle movement will help the egg flow into the fallopian tube. Fallopian tube, like we said, has 3 parts: the infundibulum, the ampulla to isthmus, going from distal to proximal. If you looked inside the fallopian tube, you'd see a folded mucosa and with simple columnar cells, secretory cells in there, and then the simple columnar cells with secretory activity would have microvilli, so it increases the surface area so that they can make and then secrete food for the potential zygote that would be undergoing mitosis. And this, on the right-hand side, this is the lining of the uterine tube. So the long yellow strands would be cilia, and then the kind of reddish balls with little projections, those would be the microvilli of the columnar cells. And then if you look inside a cilia or a flagella, in this case because we're talking about the uterine tube, it's a cilia, you can see the complex molecular mechanism that allows the cilia to move back and forth. But you don't have to know any of those molecular details for the test. It's just kind of cool to look at the way that's built. But once the egg arrives in the fallopian tube, if it gets fertilized, it's called a zygote, and then The fallopian tube using peristalsis, hopefully you remember that from the digestive system with circular and longitudinal smooth muscle and peristalsis, it will push the zygote towards the uterus, where ultimately the zygote wants to find a home in order so that it can gestate or undergo gestation. The ciliated cells, along with peristalsis, help move that zygote from the fallopian tube toward the uterus. So I told you earlier the uterus is a pear shape. It has an endometrium. That's where the fetus develops. There's 2 layers to that endometrium. We'll go over in more detail in a later lecture. The myometrium is the smooth muscle cells, and the parametrium then is the serosa, or the part of the visceral peritoneum. And then the cervix has a sphincter function at the opening of the uterus, and it holds whatever is in the uterus, holds that in, whether it's a baby or the endometrial lining. And it says here that you can, if you have human papillomavirus or HPV, that increases your risk for cancer, because the human papillomavirus will enter antigen-presenting cells. So if you remember, antigen-presenting cells are those cells found in the immune system. The broad ligament, then, remember we talked about the broad ligament. It's composed of 3 ligaments, the mesosalpinx, the mesovarium, and the mesometrium. What it is functionally, it's a sheet of parietal peritoneum. Hopefully you remember the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. Parietal peritoneum lines the cavity. So broad ligament is just a sheet of this parietal peritoneum, and it flanks the uterus, or in other words, it's on either side of the uterus, and in it, you can see in the cartoon, it encloses or folds over the uterine tube, aka the fallopian tube. At the superior margin of the broad ligament is the mesosalpinx and mesovarium, so you can see that in the superior part. And then the mesometrium is kind of on the side part of the broad ligament. And then we said the ovarian ligament takes the medial part of the ovary to the uterus, and then the suspensory ligaments take the lateral part of the ovary to the pelvic wall. And also there's, you know that if you see red tube, that's an artery, and a blue tube, that's a vein. And then the round ligament will take the ventral part of the uterus and attach that to the pelvic wall. So this is a mid-sagittal section of female reproductive system gross anatomy. And if we start again bottom right with the vagina, you can see the vaginal rugae. And just posterior to the vagina is the anus, and anterior to the vagina is the urethra that leads to the bladder. So if you travel up through the vagina, remember you go through the cervix of the uterus, and then you go into the uterus, and then from the uterus you can get into the uterine tube. At the end of the uterine tube you would meet up with the ovary. The external female genitalia then would include, if you look on the left side, bottom left side, would include the mons pubis. So that's just the fat pad that sits over the pubic symphysis bone. Then you can see the clitoris, which is the female homologue of the male penis. And just like a penis, the clitoris has a prepuce or foreskin. And then the 2 folds of skin and the external genitalia would be the labia majora. In this cartoon it's called the labium majus, and the labia minor. In this cartoon it's called the labium minus.